Hi, I'm Julie Spencer, author of the Buxton Peak series. This is Buxton Peak, Book 1, Who is Ian Taylor? And we are starting at Chapter 6. At the end of Chapter 5, Megan had just seen Ian perform the song that he had written for her, which was called Passing Through Eternity. And he played it live on Good Morning America, and that was the first time that she had seen who he really is, which was the lead singer and songwriter of the band called Buxton Peak. She's a little angry at him right now because he has never told her anything about that side of him. So she only knows him as this goofy kid that she likes. So this is called Chapter 6, Mates and Roommates. Megan. The whisper near her shoulder was unmistakable. She didn't need to turn her head to know who had snuck in the chair behind her. She would have known that velvet voice anywhere in the world, even if she hadn't just heard him sing her a love song on live television mere hours before. She refused to turn and look at him because she was still angry about his deception, but she couldn't help but grin just a little. "How did you get here so quickly?" she whispered back. It had only been 8 hours since he'd been on air in New York City. "We chartered a private jet," Ian whispered. That made her turn around in astonishment. Flanking him on either side was Ed and another man equally as large and intimidating. They looked almost comical, squeezed into the tiny seats in her chemistry lecture hall. Ian was leaning so far forward she practically ran into his nose. Before she could protest, he stole a kiss while his face was near hers. Megan felt her anger melt away, and she couldn't help smile at him. The hot young star on Good Morning America was nothing compared to the man looking her in the eye. Plus, he smelled intoxicating. The combination was more than she could handle, and she barely resisted throwing her arms around him. "Can I come up and sit by you?" He didn't wait for her to answer, just climbed over the chairs and down into the seat next to her. He draped his arm around the seat behind her and leaned close. "Are these men bothering you, Megan?" Megan's professor stood in the aisle, brow creased, arms folded across her chest. She shook her head but couldn't bring herself to answer. Instead, Ian reached out confidently to shake her professor's hand. "I'm Ian," he smiled up at Dr. Mullaney. "I'm Megan's boyfriend, for now." He turned back to her with his crooked grin and playful eyes. He winked and looked up at her professor. "I'm only in town for a couple of hours. Please let me stay. I promise I won't cause any trouble or distract her from her studies in... what is it you're teaching?" "Organic chemistry," Dr. Mullaney practically growled at him. His eyes seemed to assess Ian and his lip curled. "I doubt you've taken the prerequisites." With that, another student pulled him away to ask about a missing assignment, and Ian turned back to Megan. She turned briefly to say hello to Ed and reached her hand out to the other bodyguard who introduced himself as James. Ian laced his fingers through hers and brought her hand up to his lips for a very romantic kiss. She took a deep breath and realized this day wasn't getting any easier. "He probably feels bad for embarrassing me on live television." She shook her head slightly and grinned back at him. "So," she began, "you're a rock star, huh?" "That's what they tell me," he purred in his hypnotic British accent. She desperately wanted to turn his baseball cap around so she could see his eyes better, but knew it was part of the disguise that allowed him to be sitting next to her in the first place, so she didn't dare. She gripped his hand and barely trusted herself to sit next to him for a whole 50-minute lecture. She ripped a page from his notebook and handed him a pen so he could appear studious, but she knew it wasn't working. His charade was obvious to anyone sitting within a few rows on either side of them. He didn't belong here, and they all knew it. Ian drew little cartoons on the paper and scribbled lines from the song he'd written for her. Dr. Mullaney looked disapprovingly in their direction frequently, but didn't stop his lecture. Now this is back and forth between the lecture and the lines from the song that Ian is writing. So hopefully you'll be able to tell. As you're reading it, you can tell pretty clearly, but listening to it, I don't know if you'll be able to tell. So, Ian writes, "From the moment that we met," and Dr. Mullaney says, "Deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA as it's commonly called, is a long-chain biopolymer." "You tried to run from me." Others include peptides and polysaccharides. But fate brought us together. The most common hydrocarbon in animals is isoprene, produced through the Krebs cycle, passing through eternity. These small molecular intermediates assist in energy production. So glad that we met when we were just passing through. The steroid structures we know as cholesterol are formed by isoprenes. I'm just passing through eternity with you. How about if I read that all to you straight from the top? This is not the entire song. I do have some of the words written for the song, but it's not, the music is not written for it. Maybe someday I'll hire somebody to write the music. But here's the words that Ian actually wrote in the book. He's scribbling his notes on the piece of paper that Megan had. From the moment that we met, you tried to run from me, but fate brought us together, passing through eternity. So glad that we met when we were just passing through. I'm just passing through eternity with you. It's going to be a cool song once it's written. Anyway, okay, so now we're back to the text here. Megan reached over to his paper and added her own little love note. That was the most beautiful song I've ever heard. I can't believe you wrote that for me. I meant every word, Ian wrote back. I'm so glad we both happened to go to church that day. Can you imagine if one of us had slept in? Megan shook her head and looked him straight in the eye, ignoring the lecture hall full of classmates and the professor who was droning on about chemical compounds. The real chemistry was the electricity she felt in the space between her and her eternal companion. Her whisper was barely audible. It was meant to be. Forever. Ian and Megan kept their eyes locked for the remainder of the lecture, which, mercifully, Dr. Mullaney ended 5 minutes early. Ian practically dragged Megan into the hallway. It was only a few steps away to reach the nearest stairwell, and they stood to the side waiting for the rest of the class to shuffle past. Ian kept his head down and looked toward the wall until the last of her classmates turned the corner at the bottom of the stairs. She barely had a chance to think about it before she was in Ian's arms and he had her pushed against the far wall, hands laced into her hair in what quickly became a very passionate kiss. Ed and James respectfully turned away to give them what little privacy they could in such an enclosed space before the door opened and another student entered the stairwell. They broke apart quickly and Ian once again pulled his hat down over his face. They decided it was time to head down the stairs and out into the world as well. They'd pushed their luck enough for one evening. I want to meet your housemates, Ian told her as they walked into the cool twilight air. Or flatmates, or whatever it is you call them. My roommates? She hesitated. It's kind of a long walk from here. We have a car, he grinned. We had to jump through some hoops to rent one at the last minute like this, seeing as how Ed has a UK driving license and they had to run his name through the DVLA to be sure he doesn't have any suspensions, but we managed. Sometimes you don't make much sense when you talk, Mr. Celebrity. She shoved him playfully and gestured for him to lead the way. Actually, I have no idea where we are. Ian looked around. I was so excited to see you that my head was in the clouds and I was practically bouncing down the sidewalk. This way, Ed grunted. Megan had never heard him speak in full sentences. He reminded her of a large, handsome caveman who scowled, looking attractive but frightening at the same time. She'd been trying to decide which of her friends to fix him up with so he'd have someone to talk to while he was following Ian around the world. Now that she realized he was more of an employee than a friend, his relationship took on new meaning. He was an enigma to be rediscovered. They followed him to the rented sedan, and she gave him directions to her building. Megan snuck them in through the side entrance because guys weren't allowed in the all-girls dorms, but they managed to get up the stairs. They crowded into the common room between the 2 bedrooms of her suite. Her roommate and suitemates were there, but only Rhonda knew what had happened that morning. She stood there grinning while the other 2 learned the truth about Megan's boyfriend. They began squealing and screaming and jumping up and down like teenage girls. The resident assistant burst into the room, concerned that something was wrong. She stopped short when she saw the 2 enormous men and Megan holding the hand of none other than Ian Taylor. Having heard all about the excitement of the morning's events through social media, she put the pieces together very quickly. Megan was the Megan, Ian Taylor's Megan. Her eyes went as round as saucers and her jaw dropped. Megan rushed across the small space and slammed the door shut. Please, 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 you can't say anything to anyone. Sheila, you have to promise. None of you can. She turned to all the girls, pleading with her eyes. You embarrassed of me, love? Ian asked, stepping over and taking her hand. The other girls looked as if they were going to fall over or cry or both. The whole situation was the most romantic scandal to happen in the history of any of their lives. Of course not, she pleaded. It's just that some of us around here have to live normal lives, and the minute the world finds out who I am, my normal life will be over. Please try to understand my perspective here. I understand, he whispered. I'm just teasing you. Why do you think I've protected you all this time? I know what's going to happen the minute the press figures out who you are. Believe me, I live with it every day. I'm sorry I slipped up and told everyone your first name. He pulled her closer and looked her in the eye, finally with his hat turned backward, not hiding his beautiful face. She melted into his arms before she remembered she still had a very captive audience. They pulled away just slightly, and Sheila cleared her throat a little. You know, she started, you're not really supposed to have guys up here. I know, Megan pleaded with her RA. I'm really sorry. It won't happen again. Please don't report me. How about if we go for a little jaunt, Ian suggested. Your friends can come too. You can all meet the rest of my mates. You mean, like, your bandmates? Rhonda stammered. All the girls stared, wide-eyed and starstruck. The thought of meeting all the guys from Buxton Peak was way more exciting than just meeting Ian. Sure, Ian grinned. They're waiting back at the airport. We're going to have the pilot take us on a little tour around the city. Like, as in, fly around in your private jet? Rhonda asked, bewildered. Well, we don't actually own it, Ian assured her. It's just a charter. The girls started jumping up and down again and squealing like teenagers, and Ian laughed at them. Suddenly, they were all scrambling around, checking hair and makeup, pulling nicer clothes out of the closets to replace the sweats and ponytails with curls and miniskirts. In the flurry of activity, Ian took the opportunity to steal one little kiss, but didn't let himself get carried away again. While everyone else excitedly rushed around, getting ready to leave, he held Megan in his arms and drank in the look in her eyes. He took her left hand in his and placed a kiss on her ring finger, as if to imply there should be something else resting there. He raised his eyebrows at her with clear intention. What are you trying to say, Ian? Megan whispered. Want to marry me? He whispered back. Maybe, she told him for the second time that day. She grinned at him and laughed lightly. You haven't exactly gotten down on one knee yet. I'm not going to right now, he whispered back to her. I want to do it right. At the right time, in the right place, and with the right diamond in my hand, so I can officially place it on your finger. He kissed her hand again and looked longingly into her eyes. You were everything I ever wanted before I knew who you really were, Megan stated. What if things aren't the same? They never will be, love. He looked into her eyes with an expression that bordered on apologetic. But my feelings for you have never been anything less than sincere. You are everything I want, and I love you, and I love it that you want me just because I'm me, and not because I'm famous. I suppose that makes sense, she realized. I wouldn't want you to love me just because I'm a genius. She coyly teased him, knowing her intelligence was not what normally caught men's attention. In reality, she'd never caught any man's attention prior to meeting Ian. Or because you're beautiful and sexy and pure and amazing. He pulled her close and nuzzled her neck in a way that made her laugh aloud. That got everyone's attention again, and Megan and Ian pulled away from each other after they realized they'd been caught in a compromising position. They chuckled and knew it was time to wrap up the gathering and get on with the evening. They piled half into Jenny's new Civic and half into the rented sedan and drove out of the little airport, where they walked past the darkened terminal to the only private jet sitting on the runway. It was well lit and obviously the only structure occupied in the remote airport. Seeing the rowdy group of young people approaching the plane, the pilot lowered the stairway to let them aboard, and the girls grinned and laughed and squealed as they anticipated meeting the guys from Buxton Peak. They were met by several more bodyguards who blocked the way until Ian pushed past and waved them aside with his hand. The men relented and let the girls onto the plane, where they walked past the rows of seats to 3 young men and 1 very nervous agent sitting around a table. Megan was surprised to see they all had glasses of liquor or expensive beers in their hands, and there was a hint of marijuana in the air. That explained the relaxed posture of one of the guys and the suppressed laughter of one other. Megan didn't remember any of their names, but recognized them from when they had poked their faces into the view screen when Ian had Skyped with her. Other than that, she knew very little about them. Kai Burton stepped up first to introduce himself, and Megan recognized him as the guy who had encouraged her to tell Ian she loved him. Although he casually held a beer in his hand, he seemed almost sober as he pointed out a very stoned-looking Gary Owens, who was Buxton Peak's drummer, and Andy Smith, their bass guitarist. Megan shook their hands and introduced her roommate and suite mates, along with Sheila, her R.A. They all seemed completely starstruck and sat down amongst the guys when invited to do so. To her dismay, they also accepted beer and other alcoholic beverages. She knew them well enough to realize they wouldn't go overboard with it, but it still made her nervous. "I was afraid I was going to have to hunt you down," his agent scolded Ian. Megan was surprised to hear he was American, and thankfully sober. She liked him right away, even if he did seem like a nervous father to her irresponsible boyfriend. "You shouldn't have been gone so long. I had no idea where you were and when you were coming back. We have to be in Orlando in 12 hours. Ian waved his hand dismissively and pulled Megan over to the far corner so they could be alone. At least as alone as they could be in a small jet full of rowdy band members and newly formed groupies. "How do you stand being around them?" Megan whispered after they were seated. "Doesn't their drinking and drugs bother you?" Of course," Ian grinned at her. "But they're adults and I can't tell them how to live their lives. They're amazing musicians. Even with their vices, I couldn't ask for nicer mates." He took Megan's hand in his and smiled at her. She felt herself falling into his eyes again, and she leaned in until their foreheads touched. "What am I going to do with you?" Megan whispered. "Kiss me," he whispered back and raised his eyebrows suggestively. She complied, but they pulled away much sooner than she wanted. His breathing was heavy, and his eyes contained a hunger she'd only seen once before, when they were lying on the beach in each other's arms, and then he'd raced to leave her as quickly as he could. Ian cleared his throat and looked down at their fingers resting in his lap. Her hands resting in his lap. He caressed the tips of her fingers, and she almost fell over. "It's a really good thing we're not alone." "I agree," Megan replied. "We probably shouldn't be alone, ever. For now." His eyes pierced into her. "I want to marry you so bad right now." "That's your body talking," she whispered. "Yeah," Ian responded, "and yours is screaming right back at me." Megan couldn't disagree. She felt as if she were on fire. She knew they needed to get away from each other, and soon. "I want to hear your music." Megan changed the subject. "I've only ever heard the one song. I want to know you." Ian chuckled, made a sound that was almost a tiger growl, looked like he was going to attack her and never let go, but pulled away from her and broke eye contact long enough to get his agent's attention. "Jeremy, could you send Megan a digital copy of every song I've ever sung?" Ian looked back at her and grinned his crooked smile. "That ought to keep you busy for a few hours." "More like a few days," Jeremy grumbled, but sighed and confidently got to work on his tablet. Megan watched with interest as the man who planned Ian's life. So this is the elusive Jeremy. Jeremy's furrowed eyebrows and pursed lips were in contrast to his relaxed khakis and boat shoes. He sat back and crossed one leg over the other, ignoring all the commotion around him. Megan continued to study him while she waited for him to ask where to send the files. Within a few minutes, he looked back over and winked. Almost instantly, Megan's phone vibrated lightly, notifying her that she'd received an email. "He knows my email address?" she asked. "Of course." Ian looked at her as if she should have known that. "He emails you stuff all the time." "You share our emails with him?" she asked in disgust. Megan crossed her arms over her chest and sank back into her seat. Ian's gaping mouth and sheepish eyes conveyed the truth without him saying out loud. He tried to take her hands again, but Megan pulled away. "That's kind of creepy, Ian." The anger and apprehension that had started to surface earlier came into her heart full force. She looked over at her friends partying with his band members and felt a dread of knowing that this was the life she had just been thrust into. Drinking and drugs and girls and fancy jets and expensive hotels. It wasn't what she wanted. This wasn't the life she wanted to lead. What am I supposed to do now? Megan wanted her boyfriend back. She wanted the simple things like campfires on the beach and a regular job and children and a home in the country. She didn't want a celebrity with all the baggage that entailed. She wanted to get away from him, but realized she was now stuck inside a plane that was taxiing out to a runway that would lift her into a life she didn't want. A tear fell from her eye and she looked down quickly, hoping he hadn't seen it. She lifted her gaze to his, suddenly wishing he would notice. He needed to know how she was feeling, how this was affecting her. He met her eyes and fell to his knees in front of her, gathering her into his arms and whispering in her ear, "What is it, love? What's the matter?" He lifted her chin to look her in the eye. "Hey, I'm sorry. I never should have shared our letters with him. They were private. I realize that now. It's okay. I'll stop. I promise." He tried to dry her tears, but the way his hands were holding her face looked more like he was about to kiss her. The band members and Megan's friends must have thought Ian was on his knees proposing to her because they cheered and clinked glasses and congratulated them. Megan turned away and looked toward the dark window. Jeremy must have been perceptive enough to know something was not right, because he came over and nudged Megan closer to the window. He sat between her and the rest of the group, arm around her shoulder protectively, shielding her and comforting her at the same time. "This isn't just about the emails, is it?" Jeremy raised his eyebrows and Megan shook her head and bit her lower lip. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't be this person. I can't deal with this lifestyle. I don't want this. I never wanted this. I want Ian back." And that is the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 is called Not Your Love. Good chapter. Okay, see you next time.